Hey, RetconRaider here. Snapshot Games officially released The Briefing Number 3 on February 9th, collecting 5 new stories set in the Phoenix Point universe. Clocking in at just 38 pages, this is the shortest of the 3 briefings, but it's also the very first briefing to consist entirely of new material. Overall, the briefing number 3 contains a short introductory note, a brief speech from Tobias West, and 5 linked stories, which all feed into the same overarching narrative. These stories are all intended to collectively lead into the upcoming playable demo, which will be unveiled at the PC Gamer Weekender event on February 17th. Now, before we get started, it's important to note that each one of these stories is narrated by a different character, with the events of each story being heavily colored by the individual mindset and perception of the character narrating them. This is further compounded by deliberate obfuscation on the part of the writers, Alan Stroud and Jonas Kyratzes. After all, these stories are intended to lead into the mystery scenario that will be unveiled next week, and they don't want to give too much away in advance. The collection opens up with a short note identifying the briefing as a classified new Jericho dossier. Each story portrays select events surrounding a secret project known as Operation Vulture, which appears to be linked to the even more mysterious Operation Hecate. We'll come back to that a little later in the video. This introduction is followed by a short 2-page speech attributed to Tobias West, the founder of New Jericho. On its face, this speech is about the virtues of loyalty, and reads like fairly stereotypical propaganda, but there's a bit more to it than that. It ultimately seems to state that the soldiers of New Jericho should be loyal to the faction's cause above all else. This means that Tobias West essentially believes that the ends justify the means. Any measures are warranted, no matter how extreme, as long as it contributes towards the ultimate goal of restoring the Earth to the way it once was. When interpreted in this fashion, it brings several of the other events described in the following stories into question. Again, we'll come back to that a little later in the video. For now, let's take a moment to discuss the location where these stories take place. All 5 of these stories are set in or around Fort Freiheit, a New Jericho facility located in British Columbia, Canada, roughly 3 miles south of Garnet Peak. The facility was originally constructed in the 1960s as a bomb shelter, and was eventually purchased by Vanadium Inc. in 2021, at which point it was partially converted into a water treatment plant. By the year 2046, after the events of World War III and the first 2 Mist incursions, it was being used as a New Jericho research facility. The facility is built atop solid stone and stands 7 levels high, with the classified levels being carved into the bedrock itself. Communications are handled via a long-range radio communication tower, and internal surveillance is run on an old Cat8 IP network. The facility makes use of random screenings and purity checkpoints to rapidly detect infected individuals so they can be quickly and efficiently captured or killed. At the time the stories take place in 2046, Fort Freiheit was home to approximately 653 individuals. This included 316 military personnel, with the remainder being made up of civilian specialists and their associated dependents. The facility was kept linked to the New Jericho supply network by a series of automated trains, but it also relied on the use of hydroculture farming and old water treatment equipment to keep its population fed. Individual privileges varied depending on rank, and only military personnel were considered full citizens of New Jericho. While basic shelter and necessities were provided to all personnel, luxury items were purchased using a faction-specific currency, with personnel drawing different salaries based on their respective ranks and positions. The purpose of this facility appears to revolve around 2 secret research projects, Operation Vulture and Operation Hecate. Operation Vulture is spread out over multiple New Jericho havens and involves capturing, interrogating, and then dissecting terminally infected individuals. The goal of the project is to learn more about the mental effects of the Pandora virus, with a particular focus on learning more about the potential mental link between the virus and infected individuals. In comparison, Operation Hecate is much more mysterious, only being mentioned once by the fort's commanding officer. Fort Freiheit is described as being crucial to this project, but no other significant details are given. So, now that we know a bit more about where the stories take place, let's talk about the characters who were involved in these stories. There are 6 main characters spread out over the 5 different stories, with all of these characters playing a direct role in Project Vulture, either as one of the officers handling the project or one of the subjects being interrogated. The most prominent character is Lieutenant Irina Petyaeva, who serves as the narrator in The Interrogation, the second of the 5 short stories. Lieutenant Petyaeva was born in Omsk, Russia, prior to the Pandora virus outbreak. Her family emigrated to North America, where she spent her youth helping her uncle in an old auto shop. She took some psychology classes in college before deciding to instead sign up for the military academy, eventually joining the new Jericho military as a technician. Once Operation Vulture began, she was recommended as an interrogator due to her knowledge of psychology. While she did have inherent objections to the nature of the work, she ended up accepting the assignment and participated in interrogating at least 5 subjects. The last person she interrogated was Subject 16. Subject 16 is the only main character featured in the briefing number 3 who does not appear as a narrator, instead featuring as a support character in Petyaeva's story. Her real name is Amanda Salter, and she is described as a 14-year-old orphan who grew up in Topeka, Kansas during the aftermath of the first mist. She lived at Fort Freiheit for 2 years and was detained after a random screening discovered that she had been infected with the Pandora virus. New Jericho protocol is to treat terminally infected individuals as if they are no longer human, to avoid the complications that might be introduced by emotional attachment. The interrogation describes how Petyaeva, an inherently sentimental individual, struggles with the idea of treating Amanda as something that's less than human. Likewise, Amanda is described as exploiting the situation, emotionally manipulating Petyaeva, and refusing to cooperate with the interrogation unless Petyaeva addresses her on a personal level. This eventually led Petyaeva to breach protocol, tampering with the camera feed in the interrogation room so she could speak with Amanda privately. This approach seemed to initially get the desired results, as Amanda seemingly shared new information with Petyaeva. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a ruse, and Amanda attacked Petyaeva as soon as her guard was lowered, punching through the glass wall of her cell and deliberately infecting Petyaeva. Petyaeva panicked in the wake of the attack, realizing that not only was she infected, but that now her superiors were going to discover exactly what she had done. She ended up attacking Corporal Thomson, the guard assigned to the interrogation chamber. Immediately after knocking him unconscious, she received a text message on an old cell phone she was carrying, directing her to a mysterious set of coordinates. Petyaeva briefly entertained the idea of trying to flee the facility, but quickly decided against it when she realized it would involve hurting or even killing other people in the facility. Instead, realizing just how dangerous Amanda really was, she took Thomson's sidearm and killed Amanda, before allowing herself to be captured. This story leads directly into Heavy, the 5th and final story in the collection. This story is narrated by Corporal Isaiah Thomson, the guard that Petyaeva attacked. Thomson is described as being approximately 43 years old. He was born into a military family and grew up in Hyattstown, Maryland, before the first mist and World War III. By 2021, he began working as a teaching assistant, until he was eventually approached by Albert Saenz, a recruiter for Vanadium Inc., who first appeared in Recruiting, another short story by Alan Stroud. Thomson joined up immediately, serving with Vanadium for years afterwards. At some point during the ensuing decades, he had children, but they tragically died in 2034 during World War III. When New Jericho was established, Thomson quickly joined their ranks, finding his way to Fort Freiheit, where he was eventually assigned as one of the guards who supervised the interrogations. Heavy takes place immediately after the events of interrogation, as Thomson was being interrogated by an unnamed member of the facility's research staff. Because he was exposed to multiple infected subjects, protocol dictated that he was to be contained while the appropriate blood tests could be performed. In the meantime, he was officially supposed to be known as Subject 22. Normally, these tests would have been completed relatively quickly, but the researcher vaguely explained that the tests had been delayed due to unspecified containment problems. Shortly afterwards, Thomson was approached by the facility's commanding officer, Colonel Jack Harrelson. Just like Albert Saenz, Jack Harrelson was previously featured in Recruiting. The very first person recruited by Albert Saenz, He was a longtime veteran of the new Jericho military, and the stories make it clear that he was one of the only people at Fort Freiheit who was aware of Project Hecate. Harrelson was described as being sweaty and unsettled when he met with Thomson, briefly exchanging pleasantries before explaining that Thomson was about to be declared as infected. He went on to further explain that Thomson was needed for a special mission, that he would be placed in quarantine with other subjects, and that at some point afterwards, Thomson and the other subjects would all be released and given special instructions. Harrelson kept his orders deliberately vague, simply stating that if the special mission was successfully completed, Thomson was then to terminate any other subjects who had survived the mission. Afterwards, Thomson was then to meet up with a recovery team, who would return him to a new Jericho haven for proper testing. If he was then found to be uninfected, his life would go back to normal. Although suspicious, Thomson agreed to follow these special orders, and the story concludes with Thomson trying to decide if he actually intended to follow through with his promise. In comparison, the two other short stories included in briefing number 3 are much shorter and simpler. They introduce the final two main characters, and are deliberately inserted between the beginning and end of Petyaeva and Thomson's shared story. The first of these two characters is Subject 17, also known as Lieutenant Daniel Stoller, who serves as the narrator in The Legend of Fort Bacon. He's described as being approximately 22 years old, the son of a former Vanadium Inc. employee who grew up to be a fanatically loyal member of the new Jericho military. Showing exceptional promise as a sharpshooter during his training, he initially served in the new Jericho capital. Eager to prove himself, he later requested reassignment and was transferred to Fort Freiheit, where he was then assigned as the commanding officer of the Hunters. This 5-man squad was responsible for roaming the area around Fort Freiheit, actively seeking out and destroying potential alien threats. While on one of these hunts, Stoller and his men rescued a group of scavengers who shared the story of Fort Bacon. This story was about a haven supposedly run by former New Jericho soldiers who had deserted their posts after getting tired of eating bad food. They survived by killing and eating Pandora virus mutants, which supposedly tasted like bacon. While Stoller and his men did dismiss this as a tall tale, it still ended up piquing their curiosity. They ended up cooking and eating part of one of the mutants they had killed, and while it did indeed taste like bacon, it also infected all 5 soldiers with the Pandora virus. The group immediately began traveling back towards Fort Freiheit, but after one soldier deserted and the other 3 died, only Lieutenant Stoller actually made it back to the facility. He was identified as being infected while passing through one of the purity checkpoints, and was taken into custody for later interrogation as part of Operation Vulture. The final main character featured in these stories is Subject 21, also known as Private J.P. Richter, who serves as the narrator for Putting Bullets in Monsters. Richter was born shortly before World War III began, and only retained vague memories of how the world was before it essentially ended. He spent most of his childhood growing up in an independent haven where he was training to become a scavenger. Unfortunately, this haven was abruptly attacked by Pandora virus mutants, and despite all of their preparations, they were overrun in just 2 days. New Jericho responded to their distress calls, but arrived too late to save any of the adults. They recovered the children who had survived in one of the reinforced shelters and brought them back to a New Jericho haven. Despite hating many things about New Jericho, and not particularly caring about their goals or ideals, Richter ended up joining their military solely for the chance to get some vengeance against the Pandora virus, or, as he put it, to put bullets in monsters. This yearning for vengeance eventually led Richter to break ranks during a field mission. When ordered to stand down and allow a particularly large and dangerous mutant to escape from battle, Richter instead pursued and killed it, becoming infected in the process. Much like the characters from the other stories, he was subsequently taken into custody and interrogated as part of Project Vulture. That more or less covers the broad strokes of the new stories contained in briefing number 3, and now that we know all of the basic details, it's time to speculate about what all of this might actually mean. First, let's address the obvious. We know that these stories are all designed to lead directly into the new demo. The special mission that Harrelson alluded to at the end of Corporal Thomson's story will no doubt be the special scenario in the demo, and it would certainly explain why one of the promotional images for the upcoming demo shows what appears to be new Jericho soldiers fighting against other new Jericho soldiers. Based on the information from these stories, it sounds like the demo will allow the player to control a 4-man squad consisting of Lieutenant Petyaeva, Lieutenant Stoller, Corporal Thomson, and Private Richter. This is reinforced by the fact that these 4 characters just happen to each represent one of the 4 classes that have been confirmed for the new Jericho faction. The scenario itself will no doubt somehow tie into the mysterious Project Hecate, which of course brings us to the second big takeaway from this set of stories. Although it's not confirmed anywhere in the stories, a series of clues seems to imply that Operation Vulture, or at least the branch that was handled in Fort Freiheit, may have simply been a sham to help put Project Hecate into motion. Even worse, some clues imply that Colonel Harrelson deliberately arranged to have some of his soldiers infected just for the purposes of initiating the project. It's made clear throughout the stories in this collection that New Jericho closely monitors the people living in their havens. Things like regular screenings, security monitors, and bioscanners could all be used to carefully monitor the emotional and physical state of New Jericho personnel. It also appears that, in every case, the individuals who were infected were people with known emotional vices. These vices could then be theoretically exploited to put the individuals into situations where they were more likely to be exposed to the virus. This idea is somewhat reinforced by a brief segment of Lieutenant Petyaeva's story. When she snuck into the surveillance room to shut off the cameras, she also discovered that 3 people had been monitoring her interrogation sessions: Colonel Harrelson, a researcher named E. Samuels, and a third person using a generic military account. The idea that these soldiers were deliberately manipulated is even further reinforced by another aspect of the stories. Both Colonel Harrelson and Corporal Thomson state that Fort Freiheit survives because the soldiers there try not to draw attention to themselves. But if that's the case, then how do you explain the existence of Hunter Squad, which essentially existed for the sole purpose of constantly antagonizing the aliens? Corporal Thomson even went so far as to openly speculate on whether the sudden alien attention had been somehow provoked by something that Colonel Harrelson was doing. The stated goal of Project Vulture was to learn more about the mental effects that a Pandora virus infection had on its victims, including the mental connection it created between the host and the virus. As shown with Subject 16, Amanda Salter, many subjects were uncooperative when interrogated. In the case of the team assembled for Project Hecate, however, all 4 potential squad members clearly displayed their loyalty towards New Jericho, for their own various reasons. Perhaps New Jericho is hoping that individuals with such a deep-rooted loyalty towards New Jericho, or at least a deep-rooted enmity towards the Pandora virus, will react differently as the virus slowly spreads through their bodies. Perhaps this is why Corporal Thomson, who is supposedly uninfected, was ordered to essentially infiltrate the group. Or perhaps Corporal Thomson actually is infected, and giving him false hope is a deliberate part of the experiment. Then there's also the matter of the mysterious coordinates that Petyaeva received shortly after being infected. The cell phone she received the text on was a personal keepsake that she found during a routine scavenging mission, and the only other people who were likely to know that she had it were New Jericho soldiers. We know that New Jericho makes heavy use of refurbished pre-war technology, so arranging to send the text to Petyaeva would have easily been within their capabilities. Of course, this brings up the question of why. Why would New Jericho go to so much trouble to set up this elaborate ruse? What could possibly be so important that it would warrant deliberately sacrificing at least 9 loyal soldiers? Where do the mysterious coordinates lead, and are they directly related to Project Hecate? I suspect that we'll receive at least some answers in the upcoming demo, but then again, who knows? Maybe I'm completely wrong about all of this. Regardless, let's wrap up this analysis by talking about the other particularly notable information included in these stories. Let's talk about the Pandora virus. In Heavy, Corporal Thomson mentions that the probability of him having been infected during the containment breach was near 0. According to him, by the year 2046, the Pandora virus infection can only be transmitted with significant biological interaction. Further, Lieutenant Stoller states that the Pandora virus infection affects people differently, depending on where and how it's introduced into the human body. For example, he is the first person to confirm that New Jericho will preemptively amputate infected limbs and replace them with cybernetic prosthetics. He also clarifies that the infections to internal organs are essentially untreatable, and infections that get into the victim's circulatory system will cause transformation almost instantaneously. Perhaps most intriguing, Lieutenant Petyaeva tells us that the infection causes a cyst-like growth to develop in the brain. She speculates that this cyst is somehow related to how the virus takes over the human body. This seems to be reinforced by what we know about Amanda Salter, Subject 16. Other subjects have described the process of transformation as hearing voices, sensing a presence, or simply growing distant from their own body. In Amanda's case, she was completely under the virus's control, but showed no obvious outward signs of mutation. Much like the shape-shifting aliens in John Carpenter's The Thing, she remained lucid and appeared entirely human until she decided to attack her victim. This may be linked to the fact that, in her case, the Pandora virus had directly infected parts of her brain. Another possibility is that there may be multiple strains of the Pandora virus. The story is presented in a fashion that implies the numbers assigned to subjects indicate their individual pre-infection identities, but Alan Stroud himself has implied that the numbers may actually represent New Jericho's attempts to identify different strains of the Pandora virus, each of which may affect a host in different ways. It would certainly make sense. After all, we know that the larger mutants are constantly evolving, so would it really be all that far-fetched to imagine that the virus itself might be constantly evolving as well? Most of the characters in The Briefing Number 3 were infected in different ways. For example, Private Richter was infected while fighting a giant mutant. Lieutenant Stoller was instead infected by ingesting meat, likely a Charon. Corporal Thomson may not have been infected at all, which may imply that Subject 22 may be code for someone who is not actually infected. Perhaps most tellingly, Lieutenant Petyaeva was directly infected by Amanda Salter, Subject 16. She's also the only character who is not expressly given a subject number in the stories. If we take Mr. Stroud's suggestion at face value, this may be because Petyaeva would also be classified as Subject 16, since she would be infected with the same strain of Pandora virus that Amanda was carrying. This has potentially terrifying implications, because it could mean that there's a strain of the virus that just happens to turn the victim into a near-perfect infiltrator. A virus-controlled mutant that appears entirely human on the outside, with access to its host's memories and the ability to further spread this particular strain of the infection. Lieutenant Stoller even seems to reinforce this theory, specifically mentioning how several government shelters were destroyed after they unknowingly admitted a single infected individual. Of course, like I said before, this is all theory crafting and speculation. While I've tried to present quotes or references where appropriate, it's also important to remember that all of these stories suffer from the unreliable narrator trope. The information in each story is inherently limited by what the narrator knows, so take all of this with a grain of salt. At any rate, I think we've covered just about enough for one day. While this does leave us with a lot of new questions, at least a few of them should be answered when the new demo comes out. But until then, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love to talk about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official Facebook page, the official YouTube channel, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. Links are in the description.